Chapter 4. The next morning I saw dawn for the first time. It began not as the gorgeous fanfare over the ocean I had expected, but as a strange gray thing, like sunshine seen through burlap. I looked over to see if Phineas was awake. He was still asleep, although in this drained light he looked more dead than asleep. The ocean looked dead too, dead gray waves hissing mordantly along the beach, which was gray and dead-looking itself. I turned over and tried to sleep again, but couldn't, and so lay on my back, looking at this gray burlap sky. Very gradually, like one instrument after another being tentatively rehearsed, beacons of color began to pierce the sky. The ocean perked up a little from the reflection of these colored slivers in the sky. Bright highlights shone on the tips of waves, and beneath its gray surface, I could see lurking a deep midnight green. The beach shed its deadness and became a spectral gray-white, then more white than gray, and finally it was totally white and stainless, as pure as the shores of Eden. Phineas, still asleep on his dune, made me think of Lazarus, brought back to life by the touch of God. I didn't contemplate this transformation for long. Inside my head, for as long as I could remember, there had always been a sense of time ticking steadily. I looked at the sky and the ocean and knew that it was around 6:30. The ride back to Devon would take 3 hours at least. My important test, trigonometry, was going to be held at 10 o'clock. Phineas woke up talking. That was one of the best night's sleep I've ever had. When did you ever have a bad one? The time I broke my ankle in football. I like the way the beach looks now. Shall we have a morning swim? Are you crazy? It's too late for that. What time is it anyway? Finney knew I was a walking clock. It's going on 7 o'clock. There's time for just a short swim. And before I could say anything, he was trotting down the beach, shedding clothes as he went, and into the ocean. I waited for him where he was. He came back after a while, full of chilly glow and energy and talk. I didn't have much to say. Do you have the money? I asked once, suddenly suspecting that he had lost our joint 75 cents during the night. There was a search, a hopeless one, in the sand, and so we set off on the long ride back without any breakfast, and got to Devon just in time for my test. I flunked it. I knew I was going to as soon as I looked at the test problems. It was the first test I had ever flunked. But Finney gave me little time to worry about that. Right after lunch, there was a game of blitzball, which took most of the afternoon. And right after dinner, there was the meeting of the Super Suicide Society of the summer session. That night in our room, even though I was worn out from all the exercise, I tried to catch up to what had been happening in trigonometry. You work too hard, Finney said, sitting opposite me at the table where we read. The study lamp cast a round yellow pool between us. You know all about history and English and French and everything else. What good will trigonometry do you? I'll have to pass it to graduate for one thing. Don't give me that line. Nobody at Devon has ever been surer of graduating than you are. You aren't working for that. You want to be head of the class, valedictorian, so you can make a speech on graduation day, in Latin or something boring like that probably, and be the boy wonder of the school. I know you. Don't be stupid. I wouldn't waste my time on anything like that. You never waste your time. That's why I have to do it for you. Anyway, I grudgingly added, somebody's got to be the head of the class. You see, I knew that's what you were aiming at, he concluded quietly. Phooey. What if I was? It was a pretty good goal to have, it seemed to me. After all, he should talk. He had won and been proud to win the Galbraith football trophy and the Contact Sport Award, and there were 2 or 3 other athletic prizes he was sure to get this year or next. If I was head of the class on graduation day and made a speech and won the Ne Plus Ultra Scholastic Achievement Citation, then we would both have come out on top. We would be even, that was all. We would be even. Was that it? My eyes snapped from the textbook toward him. Did he notice the sudden glance shot across the pool of light? He didn't seem to. He went on writing down his strange curlicue notes about Thomas Hardy and Phineas Shorthand. Was that it? With his head bent over in the lamplight, I could discern a slight mound in his brow above the eyebrows, the faint bulge which is usually believed to indicate mental power. Phineas would be the first to disclaim any great mental power in himself. But what did go on in his mind? If I was head of the class and won that prize, then we would be even. His head started to come up, and mine snapped down. I glared at the textbook. Relax, he said. Your brain will explode if you keep this up. You don't need to worry about me, Finney. I'm not worried. You wouldn't. I wasn't sure I had the control to put this question. Mind if I wound up head of the class, would you? Mind? 2 clear green-blue eyes looked at me. Fat chance you've got anyway with Chet Douglas around. But you wouldn't mind, would you? I repeated in a lower and more distinct voice. He gave me that half smile of his, which had won him 1,000 conflicts. I'd kill myself out of jealous envy. I believed him. The joking manner was a scream. I believed him. In front of my eyes, the trigonometry textbook blurred into a jumble. I couldn't see. My brain exploded. He minded, despised the possibility that I might be the head of the school. There was a swift chain of explosions in my brain. One certainty after another blasted up. Like a detonation went the idea of any best friend. Up went affection and partnership and sticking by someone and relying on someone absolutely in the jungle of a boys' school. Up went the hope that there was anyone in the school, in this world, whom I could trust. Chet Douglas, I said uncertainly, is a sure thing for it. My misery was too deep to speak anymore. I scanned the page. I was having trouble breathing, as though the oxygen were leaving the room. Amid its devastation, my mind flashed from thought to thought, despairingly in search of something left which it could rely on. Not rely on absolutely, that was obliterated as a possibility. Just rely on a little, some solace, something surviving in the ruins. I found it. I found a single sustaining thought. The thought was, you and Phineas are even already. You are even in enmity. You are both coldly driving ahead for yourselves alone. You did hate him for breaking that school swimming record, but so what? He hated you for getting an A in every course but one last term. You would have had an A in that one except for him. Except for him. Then a second realization broke as clearly and bleakly as dawn at the beach. Finney had deliberately set out to wreck my studies. That explained Blitzball. That explained the nightly meetings of the Super Suicide Society. That explained his insistence that I share all his diversions. The way I believed that you're my best friend blabber. The shadow falling across his face if I didn't want to do something with him. His instinct for sharing everything with me. Sure, he wanted to share everything with me, especially his possession of D's in every subject. That way he, the great athlete, would be way ahead of me. It was all cold trickery. It was all calculated. It was all enmity. I felt better. Yes, I sensed it like the sweat of relief when nausea passes away. I felt better. We were even after all, even in enmity. The deadly rivalry was on both sides after all. I became quite a student after that. I had always been a good one, although I wasn't really interested and excited by learning itself, the way Chet Douglas was. Now I became not just good, but exceptional, with Chet Douglas my only rival in sight. But I began to see that Chet was weakened by the very genuineness of his interest in learning. He got carried away by things. For example, he was so fascinated by the tilting planes of solid geometry that he did almost as badly in geometry as I did myself. When we read Candide, it opened up a new way of looking at the world to Chet, and he continued hungrily reading Voltaire and French while the class went on to other people. He was vulnerable there because to me, they were all pretty much alike. Voltaire and Moliere and the laws of motion and the Magna Carta and the pathetic fallacy and tests of the D'Urbervilles. And I worked indiscriminately on all of them. Finney had no way of knowing this because it all happened so far ahead of him scholastically. In class, he generally sat slouched in his chair, his alert face following the discussion with an expression of philosophical comprehension. And when he was forced to speak himself, the hypnotic power of his voice combined with the singularity of his mind to produce answers which were often not right, but could rarely be branded as wrong. Written tests were his downfall because he could not speak them, and as a result, he got grades which were barely passing. It wasn't that he never worked, because he did work in short, intense bouts now and then. As that crucial summer wore on and I tightened the discipline on myself, Phineas increased his bouts of studying. I could see through that. I was more and more certainly becoming the best student in the school. Phineas was, without question, the best athlete, so in that way we were even. But while he was a very poor student, I was a pretty good athlete, and when everything was thrown into the scales, they would in the end tilt definitely toward me. The new attacks of studying were his emergency measures to save himself. I redoubled my effort. It was surprising how well we got along in these weeks. Sometimes I found it hard to remember his treachery. Sometimes I discovered myself thoughtlessly slipping back into affection for him again. It was hard to remember when one summer day after another broke into a cool effulgence over us, And there was a breath of widening life in the morning air, something hard to describe, an oxygen intoxicant, a shining northern paganism, some odor, some feeling so hopelessly promising that I would fall back in my bed on guard against it. It was hard to remember in the steady, heady, and sensual clarity of these mornings. I forgot whom I hated and who hated me. I wanted to break out crying from stabs of hopeless joy or intolerable promise, or because these mornings were too full of beauty for me, because I knew of too much hate to be contained in a world like this. Summer lazed on. No one paid any attention to us. One day, I found myself describing to Mr. Prudhomme how Phineas and I had slept on the beach, and he seemed to be quite interested in it, in all the details, so much so that he missed the point, that we had flatly broken a basic rule. No one cared. No one exercised any real discipline over us. We were on our own. August arrived with a deepening of all the summertime splendors of New Hampshire. Early in the month, we had 2 days of light, steady rain, which aroused a final fullness everywhere. The branches of the old trees, which had been familiar to me, either half denuded or completely gaunt during the winter terms at Devon, now seemed about to break from their storms of leaves. Little disregarded patches of ground revealed that they had been gardens all along, and nondescript underbrush around the gymnasium and the river broke into color. There was a latent freshness in the air, as though spring were returning in the middle of the summer. But examinations were at hand. I wasn't as ready for them as I wanted to be. The Suicide Society continued to meet every evening, and I continued to attend because I didn't want Finney to understand me as I understood him. And also, I didn't want to let him excel me in this, even though I knew that it didn't matter whether he showed me up at the tree or not, because it was what you had in your heart that counted. And I had detected that Finney's was a den of lonely, selfish ambition. He was no better than I was, no matter who won all the contests. A French examination was announced for one Friday late in August. Finney and I studied for it in the library Thursday afternoon. I went over vocabulary lists, and he wrote messages. Je ne give a damn pas about le français. Les filles en français ne wear pas le pantalon, and passed them with great seriousness to me as aide de memoire. Of course, I didn't get any work done. After supper, I went to our room to try again. Phineas came in a couple of minutes later. Arise, he began airily. Senior Overseer Charter Member. Elwyn Lepellier has announced his intention to make the leap this very night, to qualify to save his face at last. I didn't believe it for a second. Lepellier would go down paralyzed with panic on any sinking troopship before making such a jump. Finney had put him up to it, to finish me for good on the exam. I turned around with elaborate resignation. If he jumps out of that tree, I'm Mahatma Gandhi. All right, agreed Finney absently. He had a way of turning cliches inside out like that. Come on, let's go. We've got to be there. You never know. Maybe he will do it this time. Oh, for God's sake. I slammed closed the French book. What's the matter? What a performance. His face was completely questioning and candid. Studying, I snarled. Studying, you know, books, work, examinations. Yeah? He waited for me to go on, as though he didn't see what I was getting at. Ah, for God's sake. You don't know what I'm talking about. No, of course not. Not you. I stood up and slammed the chair against the desk. Okay, we go. We watched little Lily Liver Lepellier not jump from the tree, and I ruined my grade. He looked at me with an interested, surprised expression. You want to study? I began to feel a little uneasiness at this mildness of his, so I sighed heavily. Never mind, forget it. I know, I joined the club. I'm going. What else can I do? Don't go. He said it very simply and casually, as though he were saying, nice day. He shrugged. Don't go. What the hell? It's only a game. I had stopped halfway across the room, and now I just looked at him. What do you mean? I muttered. What he meant was clear enough, but I was groping for what lay behind his words, for what his thoughts could possibly be. I might have asked, who are you then? Instead, I was facing a total stranger. I didn't know you needed to study, he said simply. I didn't think you ever did. I thought it just came to you. It seemed that he had made some kind of parallel between my studies and his sports. He probably thought anything you were good at came without effort. He didn't know yet that he was unique. I couldn't quite achieve a normal speaking voice. If I need to study, then so do you. Me? He smiled faintly. Listen, I could study forever and I'd never break C. But it's different for you. You're good. You really are. If I had a brain like that, I'd have my head cut open so people could look at it. Now wait a second. He put his hands on the back of a chair and leaned toward me. I know we kid around a lot and everything, but you have to be serious sometime about something. If you're really good at something, I mean, if there's nobody or hardly anybody who's as good as you are, then you've got to be serious about that. Don't mess around, for God's sakes. He frowned disapprovingly at me. Why didn't you say you had to study before? Don't move from that desk. It's going to be all A's for you. Wait a minute, I said without any reason. It's okay. I'll oversee old Leper. I know he's not going to do it. He was at the door. Wait a minute, I said more sharply. Wait just a minute. I'm coming. No, you aren't, pal. You're going to study. Never mind my studying. You think you've done enough already? Yes. I let this drop curtly to bar him from telling me what to do about my work. He let it go at that and went out of the door ahead of me, whistling off key. We followed our gigantic shadows across the campus, and Phineas began talking in wild French to give me a little extra practice. I said nothing, my mind exploring the new dimensions of isolation around me. Any fear I had ever had of the tree was nothing beside this. It wasn't my neck, but my understanding which was menaced. He had never been jealous of me for a second. Now I knew that there never was and never could have been any rivalry between us. I was not of the same quality as he. I couldn't stand this. We reached the others loitering around the base of the tree, and Phineas began exuberantly to throw off his clothes, delighted by the fading glow of the day, the challenge of the tree, the competitive tension of all of us. He lived and flourished in such moments. Let's go, you and me, he called. A new idea struck him. We'll go together, a double jump. Neat, eh? None of this mattered now. I would have listlessly agreed to anything. He started up the wooden rungs, and I began climbing behind, up to the high limb and over the bank. Phineas ventured a little way along it, holding a thin nearby branch for support. Come out a little way, he said, and then we'll jump side by side. The countryside was striking from here, a deep green sweep of playing fields and bordering shrubbery with the school stadium white and miniature looking across the river. From behind us, the last long rays of light played across the campus, accenting every slight undulation of the land, emphasizing the separateness of each bush. Holding firmly to the trunk, I took a step toward him, and then my knees bent and I jounced the limb. Finney, his balance gone, swung his head around to look at me for an instant with extreme interest, and then he tumbled sideways, broke through the little branches below, and hit the bank with a sickening, unnatural thud. It was the first clumsy physical action I had ever seen him make. With unthinking sureness, I moved out on the limb and jumped into the river, every trace of my fear of this forgotten.